The alarms in Briar Hollow Regional Medical Center's ER had been screaming for 6 minutes straight, and Reagan Voss hadn't raised her voice once. 2 more incoming, chemical burns, respiratory distress. A paramedic shouted through the bay doors, soaked from the storm outside. Behind her, thunder rolled over the ridgeline, and somewhere past that ridge, the Ridgeline chemical plant was still burning. Miles Okafor, 26 and 3 months into night shift, stared at the monitors instead of the patients. Sats are dropping on bed for, I don't know what protocol. There's no protocol for this, Reagan said calmly, already moving, hands finding a vein without looking. So we make one. Outside, past the flooded parking lot, a sound cut through the rain. Rotor blades low and fast, cutting toward the hospital's helipad. 2 Black Hawks, running dark, inbound through a storm no sane pilot would fly in. Miles froze. Who authorized military birds at a civilian ER? Reagan didn't answer. She just looked up at the sound of those rotors the way someone looks up at an old, familiar voice. If you've ever wondered what quiet courage actually looks like in the middle of chaos, stay with this one. Subscribe now, because where this story goes next you will not see coming. Because in 9 minutes, someone was going to say a call sign over the radio that Reagan Voss hadn't heard spoken out loud in 14 years. Reagan Voss was 43 years old, and almost no one in Briar Hollow, West Virginia knew who she really was. To her coworkers, she was the calm night shift trauma nurse who never panicked, who somehow always had a plan before anyone else finished asking the question. To her neighbors, she was the quiet woman who kept bees and never talked about her past. What none of them knew was that 14 years earlier, Sergeant First Class Reagan Voss had been a U.S. Army flight medic, callsign Seraph, attached to a Black Hawk medevac unit that flew into places most people only saw on the news. She'd spent 3 tours hanging out of open helicopter doors under fire, stabilizing the dying at 120 knots. She'd trained the medics who trained other medics. And then, after a mission that took her closest friend and left her with a scar along her collarbone she never explained, she'd walked away. No goodbye tour, no medal ceremony she attended. Just discharge papers, a moving truck, and a small town far from any base. She became a civilian nurse because she still wanted to save people, just quietly, without the noise. Tonight, Miles Okafor was still staring at monitors like they'd tell him the truth faster than his own hands would. Her pressure's crashing. I need to call it. Not yet, Reagan said, steady as ever. Trust what you feel before you trust what it says. Outside, the storm was getting worse. And 40 miles away, at Ridgeline Chemical Plant, something had just gone catastrophically wrong. The first call came in at 9:47 p.m. A pressure valve failure at Ridgeline Chemical Plant, routine, contained, nothing to worry about, that's what dispatch said. By 9:52 it wasn't routine anymore. Dr. Priya Chandra, 29 and only 18 months out of residency, took the second call herself. Her voice was tight when she hung up. They're saying a secondary tank ruptured. There's a vapor cloud moving with the wind. We could be looking at 40-50 exposures. In this storm, with Route 9 already flooding? Warren Hale, the night administrator, ran a hand over his face. We've got 12 beds open. Maybe. Reagan was already pulling gowns and masks from the supply closet, stacking them by triage. Then we make more. Miles watched her, still uneasy. You're not even fazed. How are you not fazed? I am, Reagan said simply. I just don't let it slow my hands down. Outside, rain hammered the ambulance bay windows. Somewhere past the ridge, sirens were already rising. First responders converging on a scene none of them were fully equipped to handle. The plant sat at the base of a steep valley, and the only road out, Route 9, wound along a hillside that had been soaked by 3 days of storm. Priya checked her phone again. State police are saying Route 9 might not hold. There's already been a partial slide near the switchback. Reagan's hands didn't stop moving, but something in her expression sharpened, the way a compass needle settles onto true north. Then whoever's still up there, she said quietly, isn't coming down by road tonight. By 10:15, the first wave of patients arrived. Plant workers in torn coveralls, coughing, eyes streaming, skin blistered where the chemical vapor had touched exposed flesh. Reagan moved through triage like she'd done it 1,000 times because she had, just not in a hospital. This one's priority, airway swelling. Get him intubated now. This one can wait 5 minutes. Miles, start a second line on that gentleman. He's going into shock. Miles hesitated, glancing at the monitor instead of the patient's graying lips. His numbers look okay. His numbers are lagging behind his body, Reagan said, not unkindly. Look at him, not the screen. Priya caught the exchange and felt something shift in how she saw the older nurse. You've done mass casualty triage before. Once or twice, Reagan said, and left it there. The radio in Warren's office crackled. State police, confirming what everyone had feared. Route 9 had slid another 20 feet, taking out the guardrail and half the shoulder. No ambulance, no fire truck, no supply vehicle was getting up that hillside tonight. And there were still an estimated 30 workers trapped above the wash, some with severe exposure, cut off from any ground evacuation. We need air support, Warren said, almost to himself. Actual air support, not just a rescue basket. Reagan's hands stilled for just a moment over a suture kit. In that pause, something old and familiar rose up behind her eyes. A memory of another storm, another impossible extraction, another radio call that started with words no one wanted to hear. They'll come, she said quietly. If anyone's flying tonight, they'll come. At 10:31, the West Virginia Army National Guard's Aviation Support Facility received the call. Chemical exposure mass casualty event, ground routes impassable, requesting immediate air medevac. Chief Warrant Officer Dana Blake, callsign Ranger, had flown Black Hawks for 11 years, 4 of them in combat zones. She was already suited up when the alert came through, because something in her gut had told her this storm wasn't going to stay quiet. Ceilings at 600 feet and dropping. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Sam Ortiz, said, eyeing the weather display, Command's going to want a hard no on this. Command doesn't have 30 people bleeding out on a hillside, Dana said, pulling on her gloves. Colonel Grace Whitfield's voice came through on the ops line, clipped and unhappy. Ranger, I don't love sending birds into this. Ceiling's marginal, terrain's bad, and you'll be flying blind over unfamiliar ground in the dark. Copy that, Colonel. Recommend we still launch. We can route around the worst of the cell and use the valley floor for reference. There was a pause. Then 2 birds. You lead Pegasus 12. Ortiz flies chase. And Ranger, whoever's coordinating groundside at that hospital better know what they're doing, because you're going to need eyes and hands you can trust the second you touch down. Dana didn't know it yet, but 40 miles away, in a hospital hallway lit by emergency lighting, someone was about to prove exactly that. Reagan Voss stepped out to the ambulance bay doors, listening to the wind, and felt 14 years fall away in an instant. By 10:50, Briar Hollow Regional's ER looked like a war zone that had wandered into rural America by mistake. Every bed was full. The hallway held 6 more patients on gurneys, oxygen masks fogging with each labored breath. Miles moved between them, sweat on his brow, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to fear. We're out of room, he said to Reagan, voice cracking. We're completely out of room, and there's still 30 people trapped up at that plant. Then we make room, Reagan said, already directing 2 ambulatory patients toward the waiting area, freeing beds for the critical cases still arriving. Priya, I need you running secondary triage in the hallway. Warren, get me every blanket and 4 bag in the building staged by the helipad. Warren blinked. The helipad's not rated for anything bigger than a medical transport chopper. It's about to be, Reagan said. Outside, the storm hadn't let up, but something in the wind had changed. A deeper thrum beneath the thunder, rhythmic, mechanical, growing louder by the second. Priya looked up first. Do you hear that? Miles stepped toward the window, squinting through rain-streaked glass at 2 sets of navigation lights descending through the cloud deck, running steady despite the wind buffeting them sideways. Black Hawks, he said, disbelief in his voice. Those are actual military Black Hawks. Reagan didn't look up right away. She finished securing and 4-line first, hands steady as ever. Only then did she glance toward the window, toward the helipad, toward a sound she hadn't let herself miss in 14 years. "Get everyone ready," she said quietly. "They're not landing to sightsee." The first Black Hawk touched down hard against the wind, rotor wash flattening the rain sideways across the helipad in sheets. Dana Blake was out of the cockpit before the wheels had fully settled, ducking beneath the blades, scanning for whoever was in charge. What she found was chaos. A hospital staff overwhelmed, patients stacked in hallways, a young doctor shouting orders that kept getting drowned out by the storm. "Who's running triage?" Dana yelled over the rotor noise. Priya pointed, breathless. Regan Voss. She's coordinating everything." Dana pushed through the doors and found a woman kneeling beside a gurney, hands moving with a precision that stopped her mid-stride. There was something about the way she worked, economical, controlled, utterly without hesitation, that Dana had only ever seen in people who'd done this exact job under fire. "Ma'am, I need your patient list by severity, and I need it fast," Dana said. "We can take 6 critical on the first lift, 6 more on the second bird once it's clear." Regan looked up, and for a half-second, something passed between them. Recognition without a name attached to it yet. "Copy that," Regan said. "I'll have your manifest in 90 seconds. Tell your co-pilot to keep rotors turning. We don't have time for a cold start on the second run."
Dana blinked.
Civilians didn't talk like that. Nurses didn't talk like that. "Who taught you that?" Dana asked. Regan didn't answer. She was already moving toward the next patient, already building the manifest in her head the way she'd built 100 of them before, in places far worse than this one. 90 seconds later, Regan handed Dana a manifest sorted with brutal, perfect efficiency, 6 names, ranked by physiological priority, complete with vitals and estimated flight tolerance. Dana stared at it. "This is textbook. This is exactly how we'd sort it in the field." "Then let's move like it," Regan said, already helping load the first patient onto a gurney bound for the helipad. Outside, the wind hadn't eased. If anything, it had picked up, gusting hard enough to rock the idling Black Hawk on its wheels. Sam Ortiz's voice crackled over Dana's radio from the second bird. "Ranger, we've got a problem. Gust fronts rolling in off the ridge. I'm reading 28 knots crosswind on approach. I don't love a hot load in this." Dana keyed her mic, eyes on the sky. "Copy. Hold your approach. I'll advise." Miles, helping carry a patient toward the helipad doors, looked at Regan with something between awe and confusion. "How do you know how to load a Black Hawk manifest?" "You're a nurse." Regan didn't break stride. "I've done a lot of things, Miles." Back at the plant, 30 miles up a road that no longer existed, a second call came through the plant's emergency radio, patched through to the hospital by a shaking supervisor. Chemical exposure was worsening. 2 workers had stopped breathing. The window to save them was shrinking by the minute, and the storm showed no sign of breaking. Regan's jaw tightened as she listened. She looked at Dana. "Your second bird needs to go straight to the plant, not here. We stabilize what we've got. They can't wait for a second trip." Dana hesitated only a second. "That's my call to make." "Then make it fast," Regan said. "You're losing daylight you don't have." Dana keyed her radio, rerouting Ortiz's Black Hawk directly to the plant site, a decision that would put a second aircraft into deteriorating weather over unfamiliar terrain, hunting for a landing zone that didn't officially exist yet. Pegasus 14, divert to the plant coordinates. LZ to be determined on approach. "Copy." Ortiz's voice came back tight. "Copy, diverting. Visibility's garbage up here. Ranger. I'm going to need eyes on the ground the second I'm close." Regan moved to the hospital's radio room without being asked, sliding into a chair beside the plant's terrified supervisor like she'd done it every day of her life. "This is Regan Voss. I'm coordinating from Briar Hollow Regional. Talk to me about your terrain. Flat ground, no wires, no structures within 100 meters. Do you have that anywhere near your position?" The supervisor, voice shaking, described a gravel lot behind the plant's east warehouse. "That'll work," Regan said. "Get your 2 critical workers there now, and get everyone else clear of the vapor cloud's downwind path." Ortiz, you're looking for a gravel lot behind an east-facing warehouse. Flat, should be clear of obstructions. Copy, gravel lot, east warehouse. Ortiz repeated, banking his aircraft through a wall of rain. Dana watched Reagan work the radio like she'd been born doing it, giving a rattled young pilot exactly the information he needed in exactly the order he needed it, calm cutting through his rising panic like a blade through fog. "Who are you?" Dana asked quietly, almost to herself. Reagan didn't look up from the radio. "Just someone who's flown in weather like this before." Back at the hospital, the first Black Hawk lifted off with its 6 critical patients, rotors clawing against gusting crosswinds as Dana fought the controls, correcting for wind shear that tried to shove her tail rotor into the treeline bordering the parking lot. Inside the ER, chaos hadn't lessened. It had only changed shape. Miles worked beside Priya now, stabilizing the patients still waiting for the second lift. His earlier hesitance burned away by hours of forced competence. "You were right," he admitted to Reagan between patients. "About trusting what I see over what the monitor says. That man in bed 6, the machine said stable. He wasn't." "You caught it," Reagan said. "That's what matters." At the plant, Ortiz's Black Hawk descended through nearly zero visibility, guided only by Reagan's calm voice over the radio and a supervisor's flashlight waving through the rain. The skids touched gravel hard, but they touched down. 2 workers, barely breathing, were loaded in under 90 seconds. "Package secured. Lifting off," Ortiz radioed, voice flooded with relief. Reagan closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she was back on her feet, back to the next patient, back to being simply the calm nurse everyone in Briar Hollow thought they knew. But Dana Blake, banking her Black Hawk back toward the hospital through breaking clouds, was already running a name through her memory. Voss. Reagan Voss. Something about the way that name and that voice fit together nagged at a memory buried 14 years deep. A training class, a legend, a call sign spoken with reverence by every flight medic who came after. By the time Dana's Black Hawk touched down for the second time, the storm had eased just enough to think clearly, and clarity was exactly what brought the memory forward. She remembered a training deployment years ago before her first combat tour, an instructor cadre that ran the hardest medevac simulation course in the Army, the one everyone feared and everyone wanted to survive. The lead instructor had a call sign nobody used her real name for. Seraph. The one who'd once kept a soldier alive for 40 extra minutes with nothing but her hands and her voice, after everyone else had already called it. Dana climbed out of the cockpit and found Reagan exactly where she'd left her. Kneeling beside a gurney, checking a patient's pulse with 2 fingers instead of trusting the monitor beside her. "Seraph," Dana said quietly. Reagan's hands stilled. For the first time all night, something in her calm, controlled expression cracked, just slightly, like a door opening onto a room she hadn't stepped into in 14 years. "That's not a name I answer to anymore," Reagan said. "You trained half the flight medics I ever worked with," Dana said, disbelief and something like awe threading through her voice. "You're a legend. People still tell stories about you at Fort Rucker." Miles, standing nearby with an 4 bag in his hands, went very still. Priya turned from the patient she was treating, staring. "She's a nurse?" Miles said slowly, like the words didn't fit together anymore. "She's just our nurse." Reagan straightened, rain-soaked hair sticking to her face, exhaustion and old grief and something like relief all moving across her features at once. "I was a lot of things," she said quietly, "before I was just that." Word moved through the ER faster than any radio call could have carried it. By the time the second wave of plant workers arrived, half the staff was watching Reagan Voss with new eyes, and the other half didn't yet understand why. Warren Hale pulled her aside for 30 seconds she didn't have to spare. "Is it true? Were you really some kind of combat medic legend?" "I was a flight medic," Reagan said. "Nothing more special than the other soldiers who did the job. I just did it a long time, and I got good at staying calm when everyone else couldn't." "That's not nothing, Reagan. It's not everything either," she said, and went back to work. Above the valley, a second weather cell was rolling in behind the first, worse than anyone had forecast. A line of storms that would close the airspace entirely within the hour. Dana relayed the update grimly. Colonel Whitfield says we've got one more window, maybe 20 minutes, before conditions go below minimums completely. After that, nobody's flying until morning. That meant one thing: the remaining exposed workers still trapped near the plant. 6 more, according to the last radio check, needed extraction now, in this window or not until sunrise. And sunrise, for chemical exposure victims already fighting respiratory failure, might be too late. Reagan looked at the manifest in her hands, then at Dana. Then we don't waste the window arguing about it. Ortiz's bird takes the 6 from the plant. Yours takes whoever we can't stabilize here. And I'm going with him. Dana's eyebrows rose. You're a civilian now, Reagan. Tonight, Reagan said, already pulling on a spare flight vest from the equipment bag. I'm whatever this situation needs me to be. Colonel Grace Whitfield's voice crackled through the radio, sharp with concern. Ranger, confirm. You are not putting an unauthorized civilian on a National Guard aircraft in active flight operations. Dana glanced at Reagan, who stood waiting by the helipad doors, flight vest secured, expression as steady as it had been all night. Colonel, this civilian trained half our flight medic corps before some of my crew were even enlisted, Dana said. She's the reason Ortiz found a landing zone in 0 visibility 20 minutes ago. I need hands I can trust on that second lift, and hers are the steadiest in this building. There was a long pause on the line. Then, quieter, confirm call sign. Dana looked at Reagan. Reagan hesitated only a moment before answering herself, leaning toward the radio. Seraph, she said. Former flight medic, 3 tours, retired sergeant first class. I'm not asking for authorization, Colonel. I'm telling you there are 6 exposed workers up that hillside who need triage skills your crew chief doesn't have time to relearn tonight. Another pause. Then Whitfield's voice, resigned but firm. Copy, Seraph. You're cleared as mission essential medical support. 1 flight only. Ranger, get her a headset and get moving. That window's closing. Miles, watching from the doorway, felt something shift in his chest. Not fear anymore, but something closer to trust. Go, he said quietly. We've got it here. You taught me that in the last 4 hours. Reagan looked back at him once, something warm passing behind her eyes. You didn't need me to teach you. You just needed to believe you already knew. Then she climbed aboard, and the Black Hawk lifted into the closing storm. The flight up the valley was rough. Gusts slamming the airframe sideways, rain hammering the windscreen so hard Ortiz had to fly half by instinct, half by the altimeter. Reagan sat where a crew chief normally would, headset crackling, watching the terrain rise beneath them through gaps in the cloud. 2 minutes out, Ortiz called, voice tight with concentration. Same LZ as before, gravel lot, East Warehouse. Copy, Reagan said, already running through the triage plan in her head. Exactly the way she had 100 times before, in places with worse weather and higher stakes. Below, the plant supervisor's flashlight beam waved through the rain, marking the landing zone. Ortiz brought the Black Hawk down hard but controlled, skids kissing gravel as 6 workers, half carried by exhausted colleagues, stumbled toward the open cabin door. Reagan was out before the aircraft fully settled, moving between the injured with the same brutal, calm efficiency she'd shown all night. This one first respiratory distress is worse than it looks on him. This one can wait 90 seconds. Get him seated, secure his harness, watch his airway. One worker, barely conscious, gripped her sleeve as she checked his pulse. Are we gonna make it? He rasped. You already did the hard part, Reagan said, voice steady, warm despite the chaos. You held on long enough for us to get here. Now let us do ours. Behind her, Ortiz watched the load happen in under 3 minutes flat, faster than some of his own crew chiefs could manage, and understood, finally, exactly what Dana had meant back at the hospital. This wasn't a nurse who used to fly. This was a legend who'd never really stopped. The flight back was worse than the flight out. The second storm cell had arrived early, and Ortiz fought the controls through turbulence that threw the aircraft hard enough to rattle the equipment racks. Ranger, I'm losing visual reference, Ortiz radioed, tension fraying his voice. I've got vertigo coming on. I don't trust my instruments over my gut right now, and that's a bad place to be. Reagan leaned forward from the cabin, keeping her voice level even as the aircraft shuddered around them.
Sam, listen to me.
Trust the instruments. Your gut is lying to you right now, that's what vertigo does. Attitude indicator, airspeed, altitude, in that order. Nothing else matters until we're through this cell. Copy, Ortiz said, forcing his breathing to slow, forcing his eyes to stay locked on the panel instead of the black nothing outside the windscreen. Behind Reagan, one of the injured workers began seizing, chemical exposure finally overwhelming his nervous system. She moved instantly, cradling his head, clearing space around him, calling out vitals to Ortiz's crew chief without a flicker of panic entering her voice, even as the aircraft bucked beneath her. He's stable, keep flying, she said. I've got him. Ortiz broke through the bottom of the cloud deck 90 seconds later, hospital lights glowing through the rain like a beacon. Visual on the helipad, he said, relief flooding his voice. Ranger, tell them we're 2 minutes out. 6 aboard. 1 seizing but stabilized. Dana, waiting on the ground, felt her chest loosen for the first time in an hour. Copy, she radioed back. Bring her home, Seraph's got it. It was the first time all night someone had said the call sign like it simply belonged to her again. The second Black Hawk touched down hard, rain sheeting sideways across the helipad as the rotor wash flattened the storm's edge around them. Reagan was out the cabin door before the wheels fully settled, directing the unloading with the same calm precision she'd shown all night. Priya, this one's seizing, chemical-induced, needs benzodiazepines now. Miles, help me get this one onto a gurney. Watch his airway, he's swelling. Priya moved without hesitation this time, no lag, no second-guessing. Miles matched her step for step, hands steady despite the chaos, because 4 hours ago Reagan had taught him something no textbook ever had. Trust what's in front of you. Inside, Warren watched the coordinated chaos with something like wonder. We're actually going to get through this, he said, mostly to himself. Dana caught Reagan's arm gently as the last patient was wheeled inside. You didn't have to go up there. You could have stayed here and let us handle it. I could have, Reagan agreed. But I've spent 14 years telling myself I walked away from that life because I was done saving people from helicopters. Tonight I found out I just needed a reason good enough to remember why I loved it. Above them, the second storm cell was finally breaking, the worst of the wind sliding east past the ridgeline. Colonel Whitfield's voice came through the radio one last time, warmer now than it had been all night. Good work up there, Seraph. Both birds, all patients accounted for. That's a mission most crews twice your experience couldn't have pulled off clean. Reagan looked up at the clearing sky, rain slowing to a drizzle, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel something she hadn't let herself feel in 14 years.
Bride.
By midnight, the worst of the crisis had passed. The ER, still full, had settled into something resembling controlled recovery rather than chaos. Patients stabilized, families notified, the storm finally breaking apart over the ridge in ragged, retreating clouds. Priya found Reagan restocking a supply cart, hands still moving with the same unhurried precision, as if the last 6 hours hadn't happened at all. You saved this hospital tonight, Priya said. Not just the patients. All of us. I don't think half the staff would have made it through without you telling us exactly what to do. You'd have figured it out, Reagan said. People usually do when it matters enough. Why did you hide it? Priya asked quietly. The medals, the call sign, all of it. Why come to a town like this and just disappear? Reagan was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling over the cart. Because for a long time, being Seraph meant being the person everyone needed in the worst moment of their lives. And I loved that. But I also lost someone I couldn't save. Someone who trusted my hands the way that man on the helicopter trusted them tonight. After that, I didn't want to be a legend anymore. I just wanted to be quiet. Useful, but quiet. Miles, overhearing from a few feet away, looked at her with something between respect and understanding. Quiet doesn't mean small, he said. You were the calmest person in this building all night, and it turns out that's because you'd already survived worse than any of us can imagine. Reagan managed a small, tired smile. Calm isn't the absence of fear, Miles. It's just deciding fear doesn't get to drive. Outside, the last ambulance pulled away into a night finally clearing toward dawn. Dana Blake found Reagan near the ambulance bay just before the Black Hawks were scheduled to depart, both of them watching the sky lighten faintly at the edges, the storm finally spent. "Colonel Whitfield wants your information," Dana said. "Formally, for the after-action report. What you did tonight, the mission essential support, the field triage, all of it, that's going in front of people who are going to want to know your name." "They already know my name," Reagan said. "Reagan Voss, trauma nurse, Briar Hollow Regional." "You know what I mean." Reagan looked out at the two Black Hawks sitting on the helipad, rotors finally still, and something old and complicated moved behind her eyes. "Tell the Colonel I'm grateful for the opportunity to help. Tell her the call sign retired 14 years ago, and it's not coming back on any paperwork." Dana studied her for a long moment. "You realize you just ran the most efficient dual-aircraft medevac operation I've seen in years, in weather that grounded 3 other units tonight, and you did it without a uniform." "The uniform was never what did the work," Reagan said. "It was just what people needed to see, to trust that the work would get done." Dana extended a hand. "For what it's worth, Seraph, Reagan, whoever you go by, it's an honor to have flown with you tonight." Reagan shook it, something warm and worn breaking through her exhaustion. "The honor's mine, Ranger. You flew that second run through weather that would have grounded pilots twice your experience. That's not luck. That's exactly the kind of pilot this job needs." Behind them, the eastern sky had begun, faintly, to turn gold. The story didn't stay quiet for long. By morning, the local news had picked up fragments of it. A mass casualty event at Ridgeline Chemical Plant, a daring dual helicopter medevac through severe weather, and, buried in the details, mention of a hospital nurse who'd coordinated the entire operation like she'd done it for a living. Warren Hale found Reagan in the break room, staring at a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "Reporters are already calling. They want to know about the mystery nurse who flew into a chemical disaster with the National Guard." "Tell them there's no mystery," Reagan said. "Just a nurse who did her job." "Reagan," Warren's voice softened, "you don't have to keep pretending this is small. What you did tonight, what you were before tonight, that matters. People should know." Reagan finally looked up, tired in a way that went deeper than one long night. "The last time people knew everything about me, I lost the person I trusted most in the world, and I spent 14 years rebuilding myself into someone who didn't need anyone to know. I'm not ashamed of who I was, Warren. I just don't need the world to applaud it to know it mattered." Miles appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "For what it's worth, I don't need the news to tell me what you are. I watched it happen. That's enough for me." Priya nodded beside him. "Same." Reagan looked at the two of them. One who trusted a monitor over his own eyes just hours earlier, now standing steadier than she'd ever seen him, and felt something settle in her chest that 14 years of quiet hadn't quite managed to give her. Being seen by the people who mattered was enough. It always had been. Over the following days, the true scope of the night's work came into focus. 12 critical patients evacuated by air. 6 workers rescued from a chemical site cut off by landslide. 0 fatalities among those who'd made it through the hospital doors. A number that, given the conditions, no one had expected. Colonel Whitfield requested a formal meeting, driving out to Briar Hollow herself rather than summoning Reagan to a base. She found her in the hospital courtyard during a rare quiet moment between shifts. "I looked up your service record," Whitfield said without preamble. 3 tours. 2 commendations you never picked up in person. An entire training curriculum still in use at Fort Rucker that you designed. "That was a long time ago," Reagan said. "It was 14 years ago," Whitfield corrected gently. "Which means every flight medic under the age of 35 in my command trained on doctrine you wrote. You didn't disappear, Reagan. You just went quiet. There's a difference." Reagan considered that, watching a pair of cardinals move through a tree at the courtyard's edge. "What do you want from me, Colonel?" "Nothing you're not willing to give," Whitfield said. "But my aviation unit could use a civilian medical liaison. someone who understands both worlds, who can bridge military assets and civilian hospitals when disasters like this happen again. Because they will happen again. And next time, I'd like to know Seraph is already in the room, not just showing up because the sky happened to bring her there. Reagan didn't answer right away. But for the first time in 14 years, the idea of stepping back toward that world didn't feel like grief. It felt like coming home to something she'd never actually left behind. Word of the offer spread quietly through the hospital, the way meaningful things tend to when people care enough to notice. Priya found Reagan restocking supplies again, an act that had become something like a habit for both of them. A place where the hardest conversations seemed to happen easiest. "Are you going to take it?" Priya asked. "The liaison position?" "I don't know yet," Reagan admitted. 14 years ago, I told myself I was done being needed like that. Turns out the world doesn't always care what I decided. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Priya said. "Maybe you were never actually done. Maybe you just needed enough time to grieve before you were ready to be useful again." Reagan considered that for a long moment. "You've gotten wiser since that first hour of triage." Priya smiled faintly. "I had a good teacher. For 4 hours, anyway." Miles joined them, holding 2 cups of coffee, handing one wordlessly to Reagan. "For what it's worth, this place isn't the same since that night. Half the department's talking about cross-training for mass casualty response. You didn't just save lives, Reagan. You changed how we think about doing this job." Reagan took the coffee, feeling something settle in her chest that felt suspiciously like purpose again. "I never wanted a legacy," she said quietly. "I just wanted to make sure the next person in trouble had someone steady standing over them." "Maybe that is the legacy," Priya said. Outside, the sky over Briar Hollow had finally cleared completely. The storm 3 days gone. The chemical plant beginning slow repairs under new safety mandates prompted by the incident. Reagan looked out at that clear sky and, for the first time in a long while, didn't feel the need to look away from it. 2 weeks later, Reagan stood on the same helipad where it had all started, watching a single Black Hawk approach from the north, this one arriving for a far less urgent reason. Dana Blake climbed out, unhurried this time, no rotor wash chaos, no rain-soaked emergency. Just a quiet afternoon and a folder tucked under her arm. "Colonel Whitfield asked me to deliver this personally," Dana said, handing it over. "Official offer letter. Civilian Medical Liaison, West Virginia Army National Guard Aviation Support Facility. Part-time, flexible around your hospital schedule." Reagan opened the folder, scanning the details slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her without the pressure of a crisis demanding an immediate answer. "You don't have to decide today," Dana said. "But for what it's worth, every flight medic on that base already knows who Seraph is now. They've been asking when you're coming to speak to the new trainees." Reagan closed the folder, looking out at the ridgeline where, weeks ago, chaos had unfolded into something none of them would forget. "Tell them I'll come," she said finally. "Not as a legend, just as someone who's still learning how to do this job better, same as they are." Dana smiled, something like relief and respect passing over her face. Seraph never needed the legend part anyway. That was always just what people called the work when they didn't know your name. Behind them, the hospital doors opened, and Miles jogged out, waving. "Reagan, we've got an incoming trauma, multi-vehicle ETA 4 minutes." Reagan handed the folder to Dana without hesitation, already moving toward the ER doors, calm settling over her shoulders like something worn and familiar. "Some things," she said over her shoulder, "never really change." The multi-vehicle trauma turned out to be manageable. 3 patients, moderate injuries, nothing close to the scale of the chemical plant disaster. But Reagan noticed something different this time as she moved through triage. Miles didn't hesitate once. Priya called the shots with steady confidence. The whole department moved like a unit that had been tested and had come out stronger for it. "You built something here," Warren said afterward, watching the recovery bay empty out ahead of schedule, "whether you meant to or not." "I just did my job," Reagan said. "You did a lot more than that," Warren said. "You gave this whole staff permission to trust themselves under pressure." That's not something you can put in a job description, but it's the most valuable thing this hospital's gained in years. That evening, after her shift ended, Reagan drove out past the ridgeline toward the chemical plant, now surrounded by repair crews and new safety fencing. She parked at the edge of the access road and looked up at the darkening sky, remembering the sound of rotor blades cutting through rain, the weight of a manifest in her hands, the particular quiet focus that had once defined her whole life. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dana. First training session with the new medics is scheduled for next Thursday. If you're still in. Reagan looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back 3 words. Wouldn't miss it. She pocketed the phone and watched the last light fade behind the ridge, feeling, for the first time in 14 years, like the two halves of her life had finally stopped fighting each other and started fitting together instead. The following Thursday, Reagan stood at the front of a training room at the aviation support facility, facing 20 young flight medics who'd grown up hearing her call signs spoken like a piece of folklore, never expecting to meet the person behind it. Some of you have heard stories about Seraph, she began, her voice steady in a way that filled the room with quiet attention. I want to tell you something those stories usually leave out. I wasn't fearless. I was scared plenty of times, in plenty of helicopters, holding on to people who were scared worse than I was. The only difference between panic and calm is deciding, every single time, that your hands are going to keep working even when your heart is trying to convince you they should stop. A young medic near the front raised her hand. How did you know that night at the chemical plant that you could still do it? After all those years away? Reagan considered the question carefully. I didn't know, she admitted. I just remembered that the people in front of me needed steady hands more than they needed my doubts. That's all any of you will ever really need to remember, too. After the session ended, Dana caught up with her in the hallway. They're going to be talking about this class for years. Good, Reagan said. Let them talk about the lesson, not the legend. Driving home that evening, Reagan passed Briar Hollow Regional's lit-up entrance and felt something settle deep and permanent in her chest. Not the loud, sharp thrill of the old missions, but something steadier, warmer, and, for the first time in 14 years, completely at peace. She had found her way back to the sky without ever having to leave the ground. Months later, on a quiet evening shift much like the one that had started it all, Reagan Voss stood at the ambulance bay doors, watching an ordinary sunset settle golden over Briar Hollow's rooftops. Miles passed by, nodding at her the way a colleague nods at someone he respects rather than someone he's learning from now. Priya waved from across the ER, mid-conversation with a new resident she was mentoring the same way Reagan once mentored her. Inside her jacket pocket, folded small and worn at the edges, was a photograph Dana had given her. The 2 Black Hawks on the helipad the morning after the storm, rotors finally still, dawn breaking soft and gold behind them. Reagan hadn't decided yet whether to frame it or keep it hidden. Some things, she'd learned, didn't need to be displayed to matter. She still went by Reagan most days. Still kept her bees on the weekends. Still walked into this every night as simply the calm, steady nurse everyone counted on. But once a month now, she drove out to the aviation support facility and taught young medics the same lessons she'd once learned the hard way. That competence isn't loud, that courage doesn't announce itself, that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who's already survived the worst of it and come out the other side ready to help someone else survive theirs. If there's one thing this story should leave you with, it's this. The person who seems the calmest in a crisis is often the one who's already been through worse and chose, quietly, to keep showing up anyway. If the story moved you, stay close. There are more like it and more legends still hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment the sky calls them home again.